Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my moon base. You've all been chosen to be part of my elite moon unit. Begin laser ignition sequence.
Begin laser ignition!
Welcome to the first video in my new series of fleet testing videos. I have completed the ship testing. I've got results. I know what happens if I pair up one combination of ship design against another, and so I'm going to be using those results to test combinations of ships in fleets. Today in this first episode we're going to be looking at a 1-2-4-8 fleet. Now that is a fleet with an equal number of ships by naval capacity of every class. We're going to have an equal number of corvettes, destroyers, cruisers and battleships, such that there are the same weightings of each by naval capacity. And what am I going to be testing them against? Well, I am going to be testing this mixed fleet against the top dogs of my ship testing. I'm going to be testing them against fleets of battleships, and I'm also going to throw in a cheeky little fleet of corvette spam just so we know what happens. As you may already know if you've seen my ship design analysis video, where I looked at all of the results from all of my inter-ship class testing, from this we kind of saw that corvettes in some specific cases and battleships came out as the top dogs, and for that reason I'm going to be comparing these mixed fleets against the battleships mainly. If you haven't seen that video yet and you want to watch it, check it out. There's a link down below in the description. Of course, the fleet composition that you might prefer might and probably isn't going to be shown in this video. If you'd like me to test out a specific fleet composition, please comment it down below in the description. I will have a look at what you guys comment, and I'll probably run a poll to see what people want me to test next. Some of these results today are quite interesting. I was a little bit surprised about the corvette results that we're going to see in a minute, but overall they do somewhat fit into the experience I've had with the game and the experience I've seen overall. So nothing too shocking, I don't think, though some of you obviously may find it a bit shocking if this specific fleet composition is your favorite. But let's dive in and find out what we're dealing with. So we know we're coming up against battleships. That is the ship that we have to displace here with our mixed fleet. So let's look at the designs we're going to use. Well, starting off with my corvettes, they are going to be the missile corvettes. They came out on top when doing the battleship testing. Following that, I'm going to have destroyers. Those destroyers are going to be artillery destroyers. I'm going to put a neutron launcher on the front and a kinetic battery on the medium slot. I'm going to be testing out two kind of streams of design here. I'm going to be looking at an artillery focused design. So I'm going to be testing out artillery cruisers and artillery battleships. Now what I mean there is as many large slot weapons as I can get my hands on, along with the artillery combat computer, because that is going to be the best combat computer for taking on these battleships. And of course, something I should mention, when I do test out against corvettes a little bit later on, what I'm not going to be doing is swapping out all of these ships. The ships as they are now spec to fight battleships, well, we're going to see how they deal with a corvette spam as is, because I would expect in specifically a multiplayer situation for this mixed fleet to be mainly coming up against battleship fleets. And then we've got the carrier fleets. Now this one here, we're going to have basically, I'm just throwing in a carrier slot. Of course, we're always sticking with that X slot on our battleships. It is the best and most powerful weapon you can get outside of the Titan's weapon. Something else a bit interesting to notice here is that I have put a kinetic artillery on the cruiser, on the carrier cruisers. The reason for that is these ships are primarily shield based with crystal plating for their other module slots once I ran out of power. The reason for that is that crystal plating is going to be more effective before we look at the use of repeatables, which I am not using here. This is late game technology, but before repeatables come into effect. That's the test I'm doing at the moment, but that does mean that the kinetic artillery will be very useful and very helpful for these fleets to have. Finally, a note on economics. Now, I have tested here 192 naval capacity worth of ships have been pitted against each other. That's what I've looked at. Now, you could ask, is this balanced economically? And the question is emphatically Yes, the way I've actually designed these ships has meant that the change in alloy cost, and if I factor in exotic gases as a function of alloys as well, that cost is relatively equivalent across the board. There's a discrepancy at times of up to 700 alloys, which, as it isn't even one battleship, out of a total of 33,000 alloys, which is what the total cost of these fleets roughly are, of alloys plus an extra 300 to 400 rare resources added on top of that, that 700 alloys really isn't such a big change. So they are, to all intents and purposes, balanced economically. If you've seen any of these videos before, you now know what the format is. Get ready for the return of bar charts. And if bar charts are something you like and you'd like to see more of them, please consider hitting that subscribe button down below. It'll help my videos reach other players like you. So what was the first matching I tried out? Well, that was a mixed fleet of these 1, 2, 4, 8 combinations, being 1 battleship to every 2 cruisers, to every 4 destroyers, to every 8 corvettes, against a fleet of battleships. There was 192 naval capacity per side. What was the results? Well, let's look at one of the engagements here. We're going to see our artillery battleships, a fleet of just those artillery battleships, come up against a mixed class fleet, where the focus of this fleet is mainly on artillery ships. So both the cruisers and battleships here are just artillery cruisers and artillery battleships. As you can see, the battleship fleet deals heavy damage consistently to the mixed fleet, although it is forced to retreat. When we throw carrier battleships against this mixed fleet with an artillery backbone, we get opposite results. We get twice the battleship losses to the mixed losses, and not only that, the battleships are again forced to retreat. So this kind of highlights here that while carriers on paper seem great, they compete really well, they don't have the fire output that artillery has in this game. But what was the final fleet that I tried on the end there? Well, that is a mix of artillery battleships with carrier battleships. In a video testing I did previously, I found that 70% artillery and 30% carriers was able to see off corvettes. And as you can see here from the engagement earlier, actually, it was the corvettes that really carried this at the end. Most of the other ships were destroyed. The destroyers went down in the first initial salvo, and following that, the corvettes did survive for quite a while and harried the battleships quite horrendously. But when we get this 70-30 mix of artillery battleships to carrier battleships, not only do they wipe the floor with this fleet combination, they also force them to retreat. And we're looking at somewhere in the region of over 75% casualties at the end of a full engagement. So the mixed fleet with an artillery backbone does not beat battleships. But what about those carrier people out there? Anyone that loves carriers? Why don't we change it up and we'll turn our mixed fleet composition, instead of having artillery cruisers and artillery battleships, we'll swap those out for carrier cruisers and carrier battleships. Well, they do still win their engagements, absolutely, but their losses start going up a lot. Not only that, you can see from the graphs here that they barely, and actually they don't, before the disengagement, beat battleship carriers. A fleet of battleship carriers does much better against this mixed fleet of carrier composition than it did against the mixed fleet with an artillery backbone or preference. And as before, somewhat unsurprisingly, the 70-30 artillery to carrier battleship fleet did the best here overall. The really good results were achieved there. Having said that though, the mixed fleet was forced to retreat once or twice by the carrier combination fleet. And that actually happened as well in the previous test. So this mixed battleship fleet with a mixture of artillery to carrier, about 10 to 20% of the time did lose the tactical engagement, even though they did significantly more casualty. I would say this is because the initial salvo done by the artillery battleships is very important. If they manage to knock out key ships on the opposing side, the overall engagement then goes much smoother for your fleet, if your fleet is the battleship fleet. Okay, so far we have tested carrier-backed mixed fleets and we've tested artillery-backed mixed fleets. But what if we take a page out of the battleships book and we split them in a ratio of 70% to 30% artillery to carriers? what does that do to our results? Well, interestingly, it does change it up somewhat. Now we're going to be dealing quite a bit more damage to our battleships than previously, and our survival rate is going to be somewhat improved. I also tested a slightly change on the combination here because I wanted to see what if we added some flak, would that help? In the testing, I've seen that flak is abysmally not useful, but maybe in a mixed setting it is. So I swapped out half of my destroyers, 12 of the 24, from the artillery to an artillery picket destroyer with flak to take out those fighters from the carriers. That really didn't help so much. We lost more ships and inflicted less damage on the battleship, the mixed battleship fleet, than we actually were dealing with our mixed composition fleet, which was quite an interesting result to have here. It's confirmed my previous results that you really don't want to be taking these picket slots. You'd much rather have an artillery weapon or something that actually does damage output, because it's much better to kill the enemy than to hamper one of the many weapons they have at their disposal. We've seen that battleships are able to successfully beat this mixed composition fleet. The 1248 design is not able to stand up to them. However, there's something we haven't tried yet, and that's corvette spam. I hate to do it, but I do have to test it. So let's see what the results of throwing as many corvettes as we can muster at them, and in this case that's 192. Something to note before you see these results is this is not economically balanced. The value of those corvettes actually means that the corvette fleet is somewhat more expensive, roughly 10% more expensive, I think, than the mixed combination fleet of the 1248 fleet. That means these results are not balanced economically. This is just equal naval capacity. I want to stress that. Okay, so what are the results? Well, you can see here the corvettes consistently lose more ships. Against the artillery, it's kind of even Stevens in terms of losses at the full engagement. But if you've got your mixed fleet composition, you could just disengage and you'd have dealt more damage to them. So overall, the corvettes really don't pull through here. In this case, the mixed fleet is actually a better thing to take. Though, having said that, they do lose their engagements against the corvettes and are forced to retreat unless they run a full carrier build. The full carrier build is able to completely neutralize, and if you see here in the full engagement, they deal 60% casualties to those corvettes while only taking around 35% themselves. That means that here the carriers are crucial to taking on these corvettes. With the mixed, you're going to be dealing roughly equal casualties, dealing a few more hopefully than you're taking, but actually that's within error. It could be roughly equal. But if you're running a mixed fleet, you do need to be aware and quite scared of a corvette spam. Alright, that's the results of this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. Let's just summarize what we've seen here so far. So it's quite clear that a mixed fleet of carrier and artillery battleships at a ratio of 70% to 30%, roughly 2/3 to 1/3, is going to be able to defeat this 1248 mixed composition fleet of corvettes, destroyers, cruisers, and battleships. Battleships have come out on top yet again. Artillery battleships crucial as ever, though it is clear if you're coming up against corvettes in any sizable fraction, you probably want to have some carriers into that mix just to give you good odds of winning and to give you the staying power to stick around at the end of the engagement and not just win an economic victory, but also a local tactical victory.